She was born during the darkest hour in Hungary's history, a kingdom crushed under Mongol invasion and teetering on the edge of destruction. In desperation, her parents, the king and queen, vowed their unborn child to God in exchange for their nation's survival. And when Margaret entered the world, it seemed heaven had answered. But this was no ordinary princess. Even as a child, she stunned her caretakers with a serenity far beyond her years, a silent intensity that made grown warriors lower their voices in her presence. Margaret was raised not in a palace but in a monastery, trained not for politics but for sacrifice. Yet none could have imagined how fiercely she would embrace that destiny, rejecting marriage, rejecting privilege, rejecting the crown itself, choosing instead a life of poverty, harsh penance, mystical visions, and courage that startled even the saints. This is the story of a girl who loved God with such ferocity that even kings bowed before her resolve. She entered the world in 1242, at a time when Hungary was still bleeding from the Mongol invasion that had ravaged its lands, burning villages and scattering families. Though her birth brought joy to her royal parents, King Bela IV and Queen Maria Lascarina, it was shadowed by grief and fear. The king and queen had fled across the kingdom, praying desperately for deliverance. And in their fear, they made a vow: if God spared Hungary from annihilation, their next child would be given wholly to him. Margaret was that child. Even as an infant, she sensed little of the oath spoken over her, yet those who tended her noticed something strange. She rarely cried. When startled, instead of wailing, she would stare upward, her tiny face serene, as if listening. Servants whispered that the child was angel-touched, that she slept as though someone prayed over her. And perhaps she did. Queen Maria recounted years later that when she approached Margaret's cradle at night, she sometimes felt warmth hovering in the air, as though an unseen presence had been standing guard. Still, she was a child, and her earliest years unfolded with a child's simplicity, crawling across polished stone floors, tugging at her nurse's dress, laughing at the flickering shadows cast by torches. Her father would lift her into his arms, pressing his rough beard to her cheek, and whisper, "Little dove, may God guard you for what is to come." Margaret did not understand the words, but she would touch his face with grave gentleness, as if consoling him. Her parents' vow was not symbolic. When Margaret was only 3 years old, she was taken to the Dominican monastery at Veszprém. The decision had cost her mother tears, and even King Bela lingered at the threshold of the cloister, unable to hand her over. But Margaret did not struggle. According to one account, the little girl reached willingly for the prioress, a serene woman dressed in white habit and black veil. The moment Margaret was carried inside, the heavy wooden door thudded closed behind her, sealing her life's direction. The sound echoed down the corridor like a prophecy. The monastery was simple, quiet, cold in the winter, and austere in every season. For a child of royalty, it should have been a shock. Yet Margaret adapted with uncanny ease. The sisters soon discovered she had an astonishing memory for prayers. Before she could properly speak, she imitated their gestures at the divine office, raising her small hands at the Gloria Patri, bowing with solemn clumsiness, folding her fingers tightly as she tried to form the sign of the cross. One of the older sisters, Sister Agnes, often watched Margaret from a distance, her wrinkled hands folded. "She is like a small lamp," she murmured often. "Not bright enough to be noticed from afar, but steady. She will not go out easily." Margaret grew quickly, slender and bright-eyed, with an intensity unusual in children. She delighted in simple labor, carrying water, sweeping the refectory floor, folding linens too large for her small arms. When corrected, she never pouted. When praised, she seemed almost troubled. But she loved to laugh, especially when the older sisters told stories from Scripture. She would sit cross-legged, leaning forward, her dark braids swinging as she listened to tales of Elijah, Judith, the child Samuel waking at the voice of God. These stories ignited something fierce in her imagination, heroes who obeyed God at any cost. But childhood, no matter how holy, is not free from longing. One cold morning in early winter, when Margaret was about 7, a royal procession approached the monastery. Servants carried chests of clothing and fruit as gifts. Behind them rode King Bela and Queen Maria. The sisters bowed deeply, but Margaret, seeing her parents, ran across the courtyard, her feet quick and silent on the frozen earth. She appeared almost weightless as she threw herself into her mother's arms. For a moment, she was simply a daughter. Her mother wrapped her in velvet-lined sleeves, kissing her hair. "My little one," she whispered. "Do you miss us?" Margaret looked up at her, her expression softening with something both childish and strangely ancient. "I miss you," she said simply, "but I am happy here." The Queen's eyes filled with tears, and Margaret touched her cheek gently, wiping them away. It was a gesture Margaret would later repeat countless times with the sick and the sorrowing. After that visit, Margaret began to understand more fully what her life meant. She overheard her parents speaking with the prioress about vows, promises, the salvation of Hungary. For the first time, she sensed that her life had not been freely chosen, it had been given. And in the quiet of her cell that night, she found herself wrestling with a feeling she had never known before. Fear. Not fear of suffering, but fear of failing the purpose she had been born into. She knelt on the cold stone floor, wrapping her arms around herself. "God," she whispered into the silence, "help me be yours. Don't let me disappoint you." Something happened then. She would describe it years later with trembling voice. The cell seemed to brighten, not with earthly light, but with a warmth that wrapped around her like a cloak. She felt the same presence she had sensed as a baby, the unseen guardian who had stood by her cradle. And in that warmth, she felt a certainty settle in her heart. She belonged to God. Not because her parents had vowed it, but because she wanted it. From that day, everything in Margaret intensified. She prayed with a fervor that startled even the nuns. She memorized scripture, as if absorbing hunger. She practiced silence, obedience, charity, all with a seriousness more fitting to an old hermit than a girl of 8. The sisters tried to temper her zeal. One gently scolded her for rising too early in the freezing hours before dawn. Another reprimanded her for fasting too long. "Child, God does not need you to ruin your health," the prioress would say. But Margaret only bowed her head. "I want to give him everything," she whispered. "I want nothing for myself." Still, she did not become cold or austere. Her compassion blossomed with her devotion. If another girl cried, Margaret sat beside her. If a sister grew ill, Margaret tended her with skilled hands, surprising for someone so young. She moved through the monastery like someone searching for chances to love. As she entered adolescence, her beauty became unmistakable. She had the luminous, almost fragile look of her Byzantine mother, dark lashes, delicate features, and eyes so full of depth that even strangers felt drawn to her. Several ambassadors visiting the monastery were stunned by her grace and begged King Bela to release her from her vow so she might marry into their noble houses. The king hesitated. He had loved Margaret fiercely from the moment she was born. And now Hungary, rising from the ashes of Mongol destruction, needed alliances. His advisors urged him, "Your Majesty, release the girl. God will understand the needs of a kingdom." Whispers reached the monastery. Margaret heard them. And though she rarely spoke of politics, she understood the implication. She might be asked to leave the life she had embraced. One evening, finding herself alone in the chapel, she fell to her knees before the crucifix. Candles flickered on either side, casting trembling shadows on Christ's wounded form. Margaret pressed her forehead to the cold stone step. "Lord," she whispered, "I want to belong only to you. If they ask me to leave, Give me the courage to refuse. No vision came this time. No warmth wrapped around her. But something even stronger settled in her chest, a resolve like iron, a decision that would define her entire life. When King Bela arrived weeks later to speak with her, she greeted him with her usual tenderness. He took her hands, marveling at how small and soft they were. "My daughter," he began gently, "you know I love you. And you know a king must sometimes ask of his children what he wishes he did not have to ask." Margaret looked up calmly. "Father," she said, "do not ask me to leave the life God has chosen for me." He hesitated, torn between paternal love and political necessity. "But Margaret, you're still so young. Many saints began their vocations later. You could. I have already given my whole heart to God," she said softly. "I will not take it back." Her father stared at her, stunned by the firmness in her voice. It was not defiance. It was devotion. He bowed his head, defeated not by a child, but by a calling greater than royalty. From that day forward, no one dared suggest she leave religious life. When Margaret turned 12, she was transferred to the new Dominican monastery built on Rabbit Island, later known as Margaret Island in her honor, nestled in the Danube between Buda and Pest. The monastery was larger, more severe, designed for a life of rigorous discipline. Margaret welcomed it eagerly. Here she entered a new phase of spiritual intensity. She rose before the others, begged for the most menial chores, fasted often, and disciplined herself in ways that alarmed some sisters. Yet there was no pride in her austerity. If anything, she seemed to view herself as unworthy of even the simplest comforts. She once told Sister Agnes, "I do these things because I am weak. If I do not push myself, I will slip into ease again. And ease is the enemy of love." Her prayer life deepened. Witnesses later recounted that she sometimes entered a state of ecstasy so profound that she seemed unaware of her surroundings. Once, during Compline, she knelt on the stone floor, her head tilted upward, unmoving. Minutes passed, then hours. The sisters approached her, fearing she had fainted, but when they touched her shoulder, she startled awake, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I saw him," she whispered. "I saw his wounds, and he looked at me with such love that I could not breathe." She spoke no more of it, but from that night onward, her devotion to the Passion of Christ became the center of her spiritual life. She meditated endlessly on his suffering, often kneeling before the crucifix until her knees bruised. She kissed the floor before the altar so often that a faint mark formed where her forehead touched the stone. And yet, her faith was not ethereal or inaccessible. Margaret was known for her laughter, her quickness to serve, her compassion toward the clumsy, the timid, the frightened. She chastised sisters gently, forgave instantly, and radiated a joy that surprised those who expected severity from so austere a soul. Her adolescence blossomed into a period of miracles and graces, though few were made public during her lifetime. She prayed over the sick with a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years. Once, when a young nun fell gravely ill with fever, Margaret stayed by her bedside all night, wiping sweat from her brow, singing psalms softly. By dawn, the fever had broken completely. The nun swore that in the night, she had seen Margaret surrounded by a pale light, though Margaret herself would later deny it. But perhaps the greatest struggle of her youth came when her father again tried to arrange a marriage, this time with the King of Bohemia. Diplomatically, it would have strengthened Hungary's influence enormously. Spiritually, it would have destroyed the life Margaret cherished. She stood before her father, trembling not with fear, but with conviction. "I will never leave this place," she said softly. "I would rather die." The room fell silent, and for the second time, King Bela surrendered to the fire in his daughter. That moment sealed Margaret's future as irrevocably as her childhood entrance into the monastery had sealed her past. She would remain on the island, She would take full vows. And she would become, in time, not simply a princess turned nun, but a spiritual force that reshaped the lives of all who knew her. The path ahead would test her, body, heart, and soul. It would demand sacrifice and courage. It would break her and resurrect her in the same breath. And it had already begun. The monastery on Rabbit Island became the world in which Margaret of Hungary poured out her soul like water, and those who lived beside her sensed that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something both beautiful and slightly unsettling. Her vocation was no longer the obedience of a child, nor the enthusiasm of adolescence. It had ripened into something fierce, luminous, and uncompromising. She was no longer content merely to belong to God. She longed to disappear entirely into the mystery of his love. The Dominican sisters often spoke of the way she walked through the cloister, swiftly, silently, as though always chasing a sound the others could not hear. Some described her as a flame. Others said she was like a violin string held tightly between heaven and earth, vibrating with the slightest breath of grace. And yet Margaret herself believed she was nothing, less than nothing. Her humility was not poetic or performative. It was raw, almost bruising in its intensity. She refused titles, refused privileges, refused any trace of royal identity. When visitors addressed her as princess, she would bow her head and respond simply, "I am a poor sinner." Nothing more. The prioress eventually forbade anyone from using her royal titles, not only because Margaret disliked them, but because the sisters themselves began to feel that in the young nun's presence, human rank was embarrassingly trivial. Margaret's daily routine was one of relentless self-giving. She begged for the harshest tasks, laundry in the winter river, scrubbing the cold refectory floors, tending the latrines. She wanted the dirt under her nails, the ache in her back, the sting of cold water on her hands. If Christ washed the feet of fishermen, she once told a shocked visitor, "Why should I shrink from washing the feet of my sisters?" Her charity extended beyond the cloister walls. Peasants living on the island soon learned that the princess nun was never too busy to help them. They came to the gates with wounds, fevers, lost children, dying relatives. Margaret welcomed all of them. She cleaned their injuries, prayed with them, fed them bread from her own meals. She would kneel before them without hesitation, lowering herself to the ground in front of men and women who had once feared even looking directly at a royal descendant of Arpit. Some claimed to have been healed by her prayers. One fisherman who had broken his leg in several places said that Margaret laid her hand upon it and prayed, her voice trembling. By dawn, he could walk with only a slight limp. Margaret insisted it was coincidence, but the story spread throughout Buda like fire leaping from rooftop to rooftop. It was during this period that her mystical life deepened in ways that startled even the most seasoned sisters. She sometimes fell into ecstasy during the divine office, her face pale, her eyes wide and unfocused, her breathing slow and irregular. The first time it happened, the sisters feared she was dying. They rushed to her side, but when they touched her, her face lit suddenly with a trembling joy. "He let me see his face," she whispered, as though afraid even the air might steal the memory away. "Only for a moment. But it was enough to burn me." The prioress approached her afterward, concerned. "Margaret, these things must be tested. Visions can come from the enemy, not from God." Margaret bowed her head. "Then test me," she said. "I want only the truth. I want nothing that is not God." But she could not hide what happened to her. Ecstasies continued, sometimes in the chapel, sometimes in her cell, sometimes while she was kneeling in the kitchen beside a boiling pot of broth. Once, a young novice saw Margaret standing at night in the cloister garden, her face turned upward, tears streaming down her cheeks. The novice ran to her, thinking she was freezing, but was stopped short when she saw the look on Margaret's face, one of wonder so profound that it frightened her. "What do you see?" the novice whispered. Margaret blinked, startled out of her trance. "The stars," she said softly. "They look like they're praising him." And I felt as though I were standing among them. Such moments spread rumors beyond the monastery walls. Pilgrims arrived, hoping to glimpse the princess saint, to watch her pray, to touch her veil, to ask for healing. Margaret fled from this attention. She avoided crowds, hid from visitors, and asked the prioress to send people away unless they were truly in need. "I cannot bear to be praised," she confessed once. "Every kind word feels like a wound. Only God deserves love, not me." Her humility, however, could not shield her from the growing political tension that hovered like a dark cloud over the island. Hungary remained fragile after the Mongol devastation. King Bela's reign was strained by rival nobles, foreign enemies, and delicate alliances. Once again ambassadors approached him about Margaret. Her beauty and reputation had become legendary. A union with her could secure powerful alliances. This time the king did not go himself. He sent envoys. They arrived at the monastery with impeccable courtesy, bowing to the prioress and requesting an audience with Margaret. When she entered the room, she walked with her usual quiet grace, her habit frayed, her hands chapped from labor. One envoy cleared his throat. "Lady Margaret, we come with an offer of marriage from a noble house most distinguished. Your union would strengthen the realm and bring peace." Margaret listened silently, her face expressionless. When they finished, she clasped her hands together, her eyes closing briefly as though absorbing a blow. "I appreciate your message," she said softly, "but I am already wed in spirit. I belong to Christ. And if you ask me again, I will give the same answer." The envoys attempted persuasion. They spoke of political necessity, of duty, of honor. Margaret shook her head. "I will not use my body to bargain for earthly peace. God will guard Hungary far better than any marriage." When the envoys departed, frustrated, embarrassed, and yet strangely moved, the prioress found Margaret kneeling before the crucifix, her face hidden in her hands. "You spoke strongly," the prioress said gently. "I had to," Margaret whispered. "If I gave them even a crack of doubt, they would try to force me. And I fear my own weakness. So I must be firm, even when my voice trembles." It was true. Beneath her seeming invincibility, Margaret battled fear she revealed only to God. She feared failing him. She feared disappointing the sisters. She feared that her longing for heaven would be mistaken for pride. And she feared, more than anything, that she might one day cease to love with the same fire. Her fears drove her deeper into prayer. Nights became longer, her vigils more intense. Sometimes she prayed until dawn, her face so pale the sisters begged her to rest. But she refused softness. "Rest is for those who are strong," she once said. "I am not strong. I am weak, and so I must cling to God with all my strength." Yet weakness was not what the sisters saw. They saw a woman becoming, gradually, a living icon of mercy. She seemed to sense suffering before it was spoken. If a sister struggled silently with temptation, Margaret appeared beside her. If someone harbored resentment, Margaret would gently draw her into conversation until the bitterness softened. Her confessor later recalled that Margaret had an uncanny ability to reveal the roots of sin without judgment. She could see a wound, he said, and touch it without hurting it. Her compassion was not limited to spiritual wounds. During a severe winter, when peasants on the island began to starve, Margaret personally carried sacks of grain across the frozen earth, her breath puffing in white clouds, her hands numb. When confronted by the seller, who feared she was giving away too much of the monastery's food, she smiled faintly. "They are Christ," she said simply. "Would you have me turn him away?" Even the island's soldiers respected her. Once, two guards got into a violent argument, nearly drawing weapons. Margaret walked between them, her small frame dwarfed by their armor. She touched each man's arm. "My brothers," she said gently, "your anger is heavier than your swords. Lay it down." The men, both hardened veterans, looked into her eyes and lowered their weapons without a word. She was peace itself. But Margaret's path was not one of peace alone. Her austerities grew harsher as she aged. She fasted more severely, wore rough garments beneath her habit, and practiced disciplines that alarmed her confessors. They tried to moderate her. Sometimes she obeyed. Sometimes she wept at what she saw as concessions. "I want to love him without measure," she said once. "But my strength is small, and I am always tempted to comfort. I must push myself, or I will grow lukewarm." Her body began to weaken in her late 20s. Her intense fasting, ceaseless labor, and constant vigils began eroding her health. She grew thinner, paler. Her eyes, once bright with youthful intensity, now carried the depth of someone half in this world and half beyond it. Still she served. Still she prayed. Still she gave everything. Her last years were marked by an increasing gentleness, a tenderness that softened even her sternest practices. The younger sisters adored her. The older ones leaned on her frail shoulders for strength. Visitors described her as radiant, though her body looked ready to collapse. And then one winter her body finally gave way. She fell ill with a fever that spread quickly through her weakened frame. The sisters insisted she rest. Margaret resisted, but soon she could no longer rise from her bed. The island monastery grew silent. Word spread through Buddha and pest that the princess saint was dying. People gathered on the riverbanks, praying, crying, waiting for news. Inside the monastery, Margaret's cell smelled faintly of beeswax and cold stone. She lay on her narrow bed, her breathing labored, her skin burning with fever. Yet her eyes, those deep, searching eyes, remained calm. The sisters gathered around her. Some wept openly. Others whispered psalms. Margaret smiled weakly at each of them. "Do not cry," she murmured. "I am going where I have always belonged." Her confessor leaned close. "Do you fear anything, my child?" "No," she whispered. "Only that I did not love him enough." As the sisters prayed, she folded her hands, her fingers trembling. She lifted her gaze to the crucifix hanging above her bed. For a moment her expression softened into wonder, as though seeing something none of the others could. "He is coming," she whispered. And with that, the flame that had burned so fiercely, so quietly, so humbly, went out. The island was silent. The river outside seemed to pause. And the world lost a saint who had sought nothing for herself and gave everything she had, everything she was, to the God she loved with all the strength of her fragile body and all the fire of her unbreakable soul.